Hi, Ms. Community. Thank you so much for joining us for another video in our Civic and Community Engagement video series. Today, I am joined by Paul Faulkner, who is actually a Merrimack College graduate in the Master's in Education for Community Engagement program, class of 2020. He also got his Bachelor of Musical Education from Otterbein University with flute as his primary instrument. And a little bit more about Paul is that he develops curriculum resources for the performing arts classroom with an emphasis on improving musical literacy across grade levels through standards-based assessment. With over 4 years of K-12 teaching experience, his research interest centers on the intersection of arts education and community. And you also have a little bit of background in teaching in Ohio. And I think today you are presenting on what you did for your capstone in the community engagement program. So we're super excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Perfect. I think I did it. Okay, perfect. Yes, and we can see it perfectly.
Wonderful. Okay, make sure I have this. Perfect. So I'll be presenting today on my capstone research from my master's program. And so coming from a community engagement perspective from the layout of the program, and with my background as primarily a music educator, I'm coming through a policy lens as I'm looking at some issues of arts education in relation to community and policy. So to start off with, to define what I mean by a few things, arts education, I'm going to refer to more broadly as encompassing all 5 of the arts disciplines as part of the National Core Arts Standards. So that's music, visual art, theater, dance, and media arts. And then policy is really broadly referring to federal legislation, policy by federal agencies, the Department of Education at the federal level, as well as state legislation, the state departments of education. And then local policy is really a lot of different things, everything from school board and district level decisions, building level things like scheduling, classroom implementation of standards. So policy really also comes down to the way the curriculum is implemented by teachers in the classroom. So with this understanding of what arts education is and the encompassment of what policy will mean here, the way I started my research was by defining the problem. And for me, it was two-parted. So first, there's an inconsistent and an inequitable support for arts education in the United States. And then secondly, I think there's a missed opportunity to strengthen community through arts education in a way that can build social capital or a network of relationships between people and community. And so thinking of these two things, I began to review the literature, and coming from an arts background as a music and performing arts educator primarily, I believe really strongly in the inherent value of arts education. The arts are really valuable in their own right, giving a chance for students to experience beauty and engage in creativity in the classroom. But it's also really true that arts education has a lot of great secondary benefits. And so when it comes to community, research shows that the arts are correlated to positive health outcomes in community, as well as opportunities for economic growth and economic development. The arts provide a space for shared experience, for young people to develop personal agency towards positive social change in their communities, as well as a space for community building. And then thinking specifically about youth development and education in our schools, arts education is correlated to higher levels of academic achievement, arts participants getting higher grades, higher levels of civic engagement with arts participation in terms of community service and voting, and then dropout prevention as well. So considering all the things that arts education does really well and the great capacity that it has, there were 2 specific kind of confounding politics, complicating variables, if you will, that I found that I wanted to address. And so one of which, more broadly, as we think about policy in the United States, is this ideal that runs through American history of rugged individualism. wrong direction, which really means limited government intervention. And as we think about policy when it comes to education, we think about how education policy is largely, we'll talk about, relegated to the local and state levels. And arts and culture often is relegated to the nonprofit sector. And so this idea of rugged individualism really impacts how we think about policy and government and taxpayer support for arts education. And then cultural elitism is something that affects not just the United States, but a lot of Western countries more broadly. And so this dichotomy between the reflective arts or high culture and the visceral arts or popular culture. Historically, the reflective arts, high culture is often given more value, placed more highly. And that impacts how arts education can be delivered in the classroom, as well as how we think about arts and culture more broadly in our society. And this is also seen through how a lot of times funding and support and the way we think about arts and culture is established cultural institutions, oftentimes large performing arts centers, old art museums, tend to be placed higher in public mind, public conception of arts and culture, and also sometimes get more funding than more local, diverse community arts, which creates an issue of equity. And then lastly, when I think about cultural elitism, there are really two models that are primarily the way we think about arts and culture within countries. And cultural democratization is a model that we see often in older countries in Europe that have a more singular arts and culture, more homogenous national culture, and they want to preserve that culture and send it out kind of to the masses. Which creates an issue then of potentially cultural elitism if one form of the arts is valued over another. Cultural democracy, on the other hand, is really aiming to emphasize more individual differences in the arts and the wider diversity of arts and culture. And so in the United States, just because of our ideals of rugged individualism, we do tend to see more cultural democracy. And so there is a really great opportunity to expand on that by using that model more broadly as a way to address potential cultural elitism cropping up. So thinking about these confounding politics, moving on now, thinking about specific policies on how do we actually either provide for or regulate arts education in the United States. And so the arts and culture more broadly in the US is not really viewed as a public good. We generally don't have, in comparison to most other Western countries, we don't really have a national cultural policy. Our funding is very limited compared to a lot of other countries when it comes to arts and culture. Education, when it comes to provision for education in the United States, is really relegated to local and state control. Federal government doesn't have nearly as much involvement in education as we see at the state and especially at the local level. In terms of regulation for arts education, so the arts were first defined as a core subject in '94, and then in 2015 they were further defined as part of a well-rounded education. And these are the two main places where arts education is defined in federal legislation. In 1994, the first version of the National Arts Standards came out, and then it wasn't until really 2 decades later that the National Core Arts Standards were released, adding the 5th discipline of media arts. And then also recently, within a report from the Department of Education under Arne Duncan, under the last administration, one of the big recommendations for arts education was increased arts integration, finding ways to integrate the arts with other subjects. And so you'll see that this has been a trend, especially when we look at grant funding at the government level and in the nonprofit sector for arts education. So thinking about all the available literature, I moved on to analyze some of the data on what the current state of arts education is like. And so first I looked at access. Especially since the passage of No Child Left Behind, there's been a decrease in the availability of arts education as well as in the instructional time that students receive. And this has disproportionately impacted students of color, students in low-performing schools, students in small schools that have less resources, and students in urban environments. And then in terms of funding, like I mentioned, education, just by the nature of how it's set up in this country, is heavily relying on local funding. And so when it comes to arts education, a lot of times that is aided by outside sources, things like booster organizations, things like additional fundraising to support arts education programming. And so there's an issue of inequity there because, of course, wealthier communities have more resources to be able to provide that outside funding, and less affluent communities don't always have that opportunity. There are some government grant programs at the federal level, and then depending on states, but in comparison is really kind of few and far between. So one graphic that I really want to point out that's really interesting here. On the left here, this is the percent of Americans who received any arts education in childhood. Goes from 1930 on the far left side to 2008 over on the right. And so you'll see that we peaked in the 80s and then declined. By 2008, we were at the level we were in the 60s in terms of how many Americans had received arts education in their childhood, which is, I think, very concerning for arts education and arts education access. What you don't see there, though, is what's visible here in this second graph. And this shows the percent of 18 to 24-year-olds who received arts education in childhood, but it's separated by race. And so that top line, the green line, is white students, which fluctuated a bit between 1982, where you see the peak in the left graph, and 2008. But stayed relatively the same. Whereas the other two lines represent students of color. That black line represents African-American students, whereas in 1982, 50% of 18 to 24-year-old African-Americans had received arts education in childhood, and by 2008, only around 26% had. And so that drop you see in the left-hand graph is concerning, but what's most concerning is that it really disproportionately has impacted students of color. So thinking about the literature, the data, and especially some of the inequities that we see within there, there are a couple theoretical frameworks that I pulled on to inform my recommendations. So first off, Howard Mann in the 1800s talked about education being the great equalizer. And this is a phrase that's often repeated. And I think it's kind of a common understanding now that education isn't necessarily the great equalizer. It ideally can be, but it often isn't. There are inequities embedded into the system in many ways. And so two theories that I've used to think about how education could be the great equalizer: one, democratic education, most specifically the ideas of active participation, collective deliberation, thinking of education as a democratic process. And then critical pedagogy, teachers and students co-investigating toward critical reflection, how education might be able to be used as a tool to combat oppression. And then in addition to education, the arts, again, I went the wrong direction. The arts, there's a lot of research, especially the last couple of decades, on how the arts can revitalize community, both in terms of economic development and a lot of other ways. And two particular models showing how that can be possible: one, community cultural development, where social issues are addressed through cultural projects, partnering residents with artists, and creative placemaking, where cross-sector partnerships between the arts and community development initiatives are planned. And so by looking at some of this research on how the arts can revitalize community, it's clear as well then, that education, while not necessarily always the great equalizer, can create space for equity. The arts can revitalize and rebuild community. And so the thought process going into my recommendations here is that arts education should, in theory, if done right, be able to both provide a space for equity, address equity, and build community. And how great, I think, of a role arts education can play in those things. So I went ahead and defined a community engaged arts education built around equity. 4 parts here. So an equitable access to instruction, asserting that a quality arts education should be available to all students regardless of their zip code. Equitable support of funding, calling for sustainable investments in the people, the places, and the programming that make arts education possible. Equitable participation in artistic processes, stressing the inclusion of artists, both amateur and professional, through both visceral and reflective artistic mediums, so that we can encompass the broadest scope and definition of the arts. And then an equitable connection to lived experience, maintaining that arts education should be representative of classroom diversity. It should be meaningful in terms of real life application to students, and it also should be culturally responsive to the needs of those students. So using this definition that I created, I went ahead and made several more specific recommendations. So at the local level, in terms of practice, how do we design curriculum around these ideas? You know, the new standards place a greater emphasis on the connecting standards in terms of the arts in relation to other subjects, and an artistic discipline in relation to another artistic discipline. How do we expand on some of that work in a way that is relevant to students and connecting to their lived experience? You know, professional development is also really important here. So we empower teachers with the ability to redesign their curriculum in a way that addresses inequities and is more relevant to student lived experience. Things like popular music education, community arts work are not normally addressed in pre-service teacher education for arts educators. And so providing opportunities to train and provide professional development for teachers to be able to implement this. Partnerships. So there are a lot of great examples of the nonprofit sector filling in the gap where the government has really kind of dropped the ball in funding. What I'm really interested, though, is in looking at models of artist residencies in other countries where artists are actually government funded, as well as some history of government funding artist residencies in the United States. And seeing how we might be able to create a program of collaborative artist residencies where government-funded artists are brought in to supplement the arts education being done in schools in a way where they can also collaborate with the community on projects through community cultural development or creative place-making models. And so then, additionally, kind of more broadly, when we think about state and federal policy, you know, how do we improve state arts policy? It's fairly inconsistent in terms of what states require, but more importantly, data is kind of unclear in a lot of places. We have some data, we don't have others, and so knowing, well, you know, we have access to arts education for, you know, XYZ students, or in this state or in that state, and if we don't have the data to show that, it can be kind of difficult. New Jersey, just a couple years ago, was the first state to declare that they've reached universal access for arts education, where all students in the state had access to at least one form of arts education, which is great. But why is New Jersey the first one to have done that? And in most states, students are actually required to have more than one arts education. And so in many places, we're not actually in compliance with what's defined at the state level in terms of the arts education students should be receiving. And better data reporting will help us to kind of more address those inequities because we can see where they are. And then making sure we're maintaining the funding at the federal level through grant programs, through the arts and education programs at the Department of Education, as well as expanding arts education funding through the National Endowment for the Arts. And so before I close, thinking about, well, how can we maybe get involved as we think more about this? You know, how can we talk to our colleagues and our school leadership about the arts education in our own community, and about the needs that there might be in our own schools or in our own districts? The school board makes so many important decisions at the local level about arts education, as well other elected officials at the state and federal levels. You know, letting them know what's important to you when it comes to arts and culture, is what's important to you when it comes to arts education policy is really key. These two sites I find really useful when thinking about information on arts policy, arts education, arts research. Americans for the Arts is great. They have tons of resources on research and policy and recent news and things like that. The Arts Education Partnership is a great place to look up information on some research studies, as well as information on some of the differences between state arts policies. And then if you're an arts educator, you're probably a member of one of these, but each artistic discipline has their own professional development organization. Their sites have great resources on advocacy and policy for their own unique discipline, as well as for the arts more broadly. And so that's a great place to start to find some resources as well. If there are any questions or additional information, my email is here as well.
This is so cool. Thank you so much. You can feel free to unshare your screen because I'm going to just let you know some of my takeaways.
There we go.
There you go. And I will add that email to the description. I was literally just thinking of how I was going to ask if you had any resources that you wanted to add, and that last slide was literally perfect. So in the description of this video, I will be sure to add any of the links to any of those sites. Or do you know if those professional development organizations have websites? I would assume
yes.
so, but okay, great.
Yes.
So I'll get those as well down below. Paul's paper can be there. It's on Merrimack ScholarWorks if you're interested to learn more. But I was just so excited to hear all this. I don't know how much the Mintz has offered about arts education. So I think that this was a great overview and also went into some depth. So if you're an arts educator and you're watching this, you've definitely found the right spot. I loved the graphs. I really thought that those were really helpful. And I mean, I'm just a visual learner, so I loved seeing that. I thought it was really striking. And just, yeah, the language, it's something new that we haven't really dived much deeply into. And I loved your own definitions with the equity, and the recommendations were just so awesome. And yeah, I just loved it. So those are really my key takeaways, and I'm hoping that some educators watching will also leave with some key takeaways. And I will leave this last little section if you had any final words or takeaways of your own, and then we will wrap up.
I think that about covers it. I find ways to be involved in arts and culture and support those who are helping young people do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I will be sure to add everything to the description box, and we have a Rogers Center for the Performing Arts on Merrimack's campus, so I'll add that to see if there's any cool offerings or if there's anything else in the Merrimack Valley. But yeah, just see what's out in your own neighborhoods. And thank you again, Paul, for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, bye everybody. See you next time.